It was the winter of 1943, and Munich, once the proud cradle of the Reich's delirious dreams, now stood beneath a pall of grey smoke and crumbling faith. The war had aged the city beyond recognition. Rubble filled the boulevards where parades once marched. Statues of marble heroes were now eyeless ghosts, their faces eaten by shrapnel. The cold wind carried a smell of coal, blood, and boiled potatoes, the odor of a civilization devouring itself. Beneath the roar of distant bombers and the metallic echo of propaganda loudspeakers, there existed another layer of the city, a hidden network of basements, laboratories, and sealed rooms where science no longer served reason, but ideology. And it was there, in that dark underbelly, that the story began. A story not found in any archive, not whispered in any testimony, but buried under a silence so deliberate that even memory itself seemed complicit. At the edge of Munich, beyond the outskirts where trains rattled toward Dachau, stood an unmarked facility disguised as a sanatorium for rehabilitation of special patients. Its walls were whitewashed but windowless, its corridors echoing with the soft click of leather boots and the faint hum of machines. Officially, it was part of the Institut für Erbgesundheit, an institute for hereditary health, a euphemism crafted by bureaucrats to sanitize horror. Inside, a man named Obersturmführer Heinrich Adler presided with the elegance of a surgeon and the coldness of a machine. He was tall, meticulous, his spectacles glinting under the dim bulbs, as though he saw more than human eyes were meant to. To his superiors, Adler was a visionary geneticist devoted to the purification of bloodlines. To those who knew him privately, his orderlies, his wife, his victims, he was something far more ambiguous, a man torn between intellect and madness, curiosity and cruelty. His wife, Lieselotte, embodied the contradictions of her time, a woman educated in philosophy and music, raised among aristocrats yet willingly bound to a system that crushed everything beautiful. She lived in the upper quarters of the institute, her piano silenced under sheets of dust, her days consumed by waiting. Waiting for Heinrich to return from his nocturnal studies, waiting for the thunder of planes to fade, waiting perhaps for the war to end, or for something even darker to begin. Their marriage was not one of affection, but of ritual. Their home a theater of unspoken desires and mutual observation. When Heinrich stared too long into his microscope, Lieselotte wondered whether his fascination with human anomalies concealed a hunger he could not name. She had seen him watching the prisoners through the reinforced glass of the laboratory, his breath shallow, his gloved hand trembling just enough to betray what words never could. The arrival of prisoner number 47B changed everything. It happened on a Tuesday morning, when frost coated the iron gates and the guards' laughter carried the cruelty of boredom. The prisoner came wrapped in a thin grey blanket, head shaved, wrists bound with leather straps. On the transport manifest under the column "Reason for Detainment," someone had written, "Sexual deviation, intersex morphology." His name, Elias Braun, had been crossed out, replaced by a number. 19 years old, half Jewish, accused of corrupting the natural order. When the guards pulled the blanket away, the room fell into a silence that was not quite scientific, not quite human. Heinrich adjusted his glasses and whispered, "Fascinating," while Lieselotte, standing behind him, felt something stir in the pit of her stomach. Not pity, but recognition. There was something in Elias's face, something unbroken in his eyes, that unsettled her far more than his body ever could. That night, Heinrich recorded his first notes. Subject exhibits dual gonadal formation, ambiguous phenotypic traits, voice soft, manner timid, yet musculature resilient. Possible evidence of hormonal interference in early gestation. Recommend further examination. But beneath the sterile language there was a pulse of excitement, a tremor of something forbidden. For Heinrich, Elias was no longer a prisoner, he was an unanswered question. For Lieselotte, he was a mirror of all her contradictions, purity corrupted, beauty imprisoned, faith dismembered by science. In the days that followed, she found excuses to bring food to the basement, to linger near the cell door, to speak softly through the bars while pretending to deliver instructions. Elias rarely responded, yet his silence seemed more eloquent than any confession. In that silence she heard the echo of her own repression, the ghost of every truth she had denied to survive in a world ruled by men like her husband. Meanwhile, the war outside crept closer. Allied planes roared overhead, and the city trembled under nightly bombardments. The Institute's walls shook, dust falling from the ceiling like grey snow. But inside, Heinrich's world grew smaller, narrower, more obsessed. He cancelled staff rotations, dismissed assistants, and sealed sections of the lab with coded locks. "This work," he told his wife, "will redefine biology." She nodded, but inside she wondered whether he was speaking of biology or of himself. A man dissecting humanity in search of the divine, only to find the monstrous. By the end of that winter, the Institute no longer resembled a medical facility. It had become a shrine to one man's delusion. Shelves overflowed with labeled jars containing fragments of flesh suspended in yellow fluid. Files filled with meticulous sketches of organs and measurements of symmetry occupied every table. In the center of it all stood Elias, pale and silent, the living centerpiece of a grotesque experiment that blended faith, lust, and ideology. Outside, Germany burned. Inside, beneath Munich, a new fire was lit, one that consumed not cities, but souls. And yet in those shadows there lingered something unspoken, a sense that what unfolded there would never truly die. That the ruins of that laboratory would one day whisper through the centuries, carrying the story of a prisoner without a name, a doctor without mercy, and a woman who watched, trembling, as science became sin. In the weeks that followed, time in the Institute lost its natural rhythm. Daylight and night became indistinguishable within those concrete walls, where every sound was muffled by the thickness of secrecy. The guards spoke in whispers. Even the rats seemed to move cautiously through the shadows, as if aware that this was not a place where living things should exist. Elias's cell smelled faintly of disinfectant and despair, a narrow space where air was rationed as carefully as food. Each morning, the heavy door would open, and the sound of polished boots would announce Heinrich Adler's arrival, precise, mechanical, unhurried. He carried a clipboard in one hand and a scalpel in the other, symbols of order and authority. To him, Elias was no longer a human being but an equation, a problem that might one day prove or disprove the existence of biological corruption. Yet beneath that clinical surface lay something unspeakable, a hunger disguised as research, a fascination that began to erode the thin line between science and desire. The experiments began modestly, measurements of bone density, hormone ratios, reflex responses. But Heinrich's eyes lingered too long on the details his pen pretended to ignore. He would stand inches from Elias's bare skin, his breath cold as the metal instruments he used. "Do you feel pain?" he would ask, not out of empathy but curiosity. Elias rarely answered. Silence became his only defense, a way to reclaim a fragment of control in a world designed to strip it away. But that silence enraged Heinrich, because it reminded him of something he feared most: resistance that did not come through rebellion, but through dignity. Upstairs, Lieselotte listened to the faint echoes of her husband's voice through the floorboards. She had begun visiting the basement under pretexts, delivering food, cleaning, assisting with notes. Heinrich allowed it at first, even encouraged it, believing her presence would soothe the subject. But Lieselotte's gaze was different from his, softer, searching, human. She brought Elias small acts of kindness disguised as routine, a clean towel, an extra piece of bread, a few minutes of conversation when the guards turned away. At first it was pity, or perhaps guilt, but pity, when mixed with loneliness, easily mutates into desire. The more she spoke to Elias, the more she realized how little she knew of her own heart, and how much she had forgotten about touch that was not ownership. One night, after Heinrich had retired to his study, Lieselotte descended the stairs barefoot, carrying a bottle of wine and a candle. The light flickered on the damp walls, turning the shadows into living things. She told herself she only wanted to talk, to understand what her husband saw when he looked at Elias, but as she approached the cell, she felt her pulse quicken, her voice falter. "Do you hate him?" she whispered through the bars. Elias looked at her, his eyes hollow yet alert. "I don't hate anyone," he said. The words simple and calm struck her like a confession. In that moment, Liselott felt something she had not felt in years, not desire, but recognition. The realization that purity, as her husband defined it, was the true disease. Heinrich, however, was not blind. He began to notice changes in his wife, the way she lingered near the basement door, the softness that had returned to her face, the quiet defiance in her eyes. One evening, he found her folding a small piece of cloth marked with Elias's number. She froze when he spoke her name. "You are contaminating the work," he said coldly, though his voice trembled with something deeper than anger. She did not answer. That silence, the same silence that once belonged to Elias, now belonged to her. Heinrich began to watch her the way he watched his subjects, clinically, obsessively, waiting for proof of betrayal. Soon, his scientific notes began to change. The handwriting grew erratic, the language more emotional, infected by jealousy and paranoia. He no longer wrote of chromosomes or glands, but of moral inversion, spiritual contagion, the merging of opposites. His laboratory became a temple to his unraveling mind. He began making Elias recite prayers during examinations, convinced that the voice of impurity would betray divine truth. At times, he forced Liselott to observe, commanding her to witness the failure of nature. But the more he tried to dominate, the more the power slipped from his hands. Liselott's compassion, Elias's silence, these became his undoing. They were not revolts of violence, but of presence, quiet and unbreakable. Then came the night when the boundaries shattered entirely. Heinrich, drunk on morphine and humiliation, entered the cell unannounced. The candlelight cast monstrous silhouettes on the wall, three figures bound by fear, desire, and degradation. What happened in that room was neither love nor hatred. It was the collapse of both. When it ended, no one spoke. Heinrich left without looking back, and Liselotte stayed, her trembling hands trying to wash away the blood, the sweat, the guilt that would never leave her. In that silence, something irreversible had taken root, not just the merging of bodies, but the merging of fates. Afterward, Heinrich's behavior changed. He no longer allowed assistants near the basement. He sealed off records, erased entries, and ordered new medical supplies without explanation. Yet his obsession only deepened. He would stare at Elias for hours, muttering under his breath about the perfection of contradiction. Sometimes he seemed almost tender, other times violent, as if trying to destroy the very thing that enslaved him. Liselott, meanwhile, drifted through the house like a ghost, consumed by nausea and nightmares. Her once perfect handwriting, once the envy of her friends, now filled pages with lines of poetry crossed out and rewritten until the paper tore. She began avoiding mirrors. When she looked into them, she swore she could see not her reflection, but Elias's eyes staring back. By the end of that winter, the Institute had become a mausoleum of secrecy. Outside, the war roared like a dying beast. Inside, a quieter war raged, one made of touch, silence, and contamination. What had begun as an experiment in anatomy had become an experiment in desire, corruption, and power. Heinrich wrote in his final notes of that period, "The body defies classification. There is no purity, only tension. The subject's duality infects everything it touches." He would never admit it, but the infection had already begun. It was not syphilis, not yet. It was something far more insidious, the disease of fascination, the rot of the human soul when it stares too long into its own reflection and sees both heaven and hell staring back. Spring arrived late in 1944, carrying with it not renewal, but the smell of decay. The war was bleeding into Germany's soil. Air raids became the city's new rhythm, and every dawn revealed new ruins. In Munich's outskirts, the Institute stood intact, its thick walls humming with electricity from a dying grid. Inside, however, the decay had already begun, not in the structure but in its people. The once sterile corridors now reeked of chemicals, sweat, and fear. The assistants had been dismissed, the guards kept their distance, and only 3 figures remained within that sealed world. Heinrich Adler, his wife Liselotte, and Elias, the prisoner whose body had become both specimen and symbol. What began as an experiment in anatomy had transformed into something grotesquely spiritual, a private ritual of dominance, guilt, and forbidden longing. But the body, always the body, had its own way of exacting justice. It began with small tremors. Liselott noticed her hands shaking when she tried to play the piano, though she hadn't touched it in months. At first, she blamed exhaustion. Then came the headaches, splitting, electric, and relentless. Heinrich, whose own nerves were frayed by sleeplessness and morphine, dismissed her complaints. "The mind rebels when it lacks discipline," he muttered, though his eyes betrayed unease. Soon after, Elias began coughing blood. The stains on the pillow, faint at first, darkened each morning. Heinrich recorded the symptoms with mechanical precision: ulcers, fever, tremors, neuropathic pain. He knew the pattern. He had studied it in others. Yet he refused to acknowledge the truth until the rash appeared. Red blossoms creeping along Liselott's chest, mirrored perfectly on Elias's arms. The symmetry was undeniable. Syphilis. In any other time, any other place, the diagnosis would have meant shame and secrecy. Here it meant revelation, proof that their lives had merged beyond redemption. Heinrich locked himself in the study for hours, reading outdated medical treatises, scribbling equations on the walls, muttering about moral infection and divine contamination. When he finally emerged, his face was pale and ecstatic. "We are witnessing the collapse of natural boundaries," he whispered to no one in particular. To him, the disease was no longer a curse, but a confirmation, the visible mark of the corruption he had sought to expose. He began documenting its progression with fanatic precision. He drew blood from both bodies daily, labeling each vial with initials and dates as if chronicling a sacred experiment. The fluids, the rashes, the sores, all became data points in his descent into madness. Liselott's condition worsened. Her once luminous face turned waxen, her lips cracked from fever. She still visited Elias's room, though now her steps faltered, her voice rasped. Sometimes she would sit beside his cot, her hand trembling as it brushed his forehead. "We are dying," she whispered once, not as lament, but as confession. Elias, whose body had grown frail, only nodded. "Maybe we already did," he said. The words pierced her more deeply than any symptom. In that dim cell, surrounded by the echo of dripping pipes and the faint hum of machines, they spoke not of salvation, but of memory, of childhood, of dreams that had no place in a world of uniforms and ash. In those final conversations, the experiment turned human again, if only for a moment. Heinrich could not bear it. The intimacy he had once controlled now excluded him. He began injecting them both with mercury and arsenic solutions, the Reich's prescribed treatments. The process was torture disguised as science. Liselott screamed as the poison coursed through her veins. Elias endured in silence, eyes fixed on the ceiling, his body twitching under the restraints. Heinrich recorded it all, the convulsions, the fevers, the collapse. He called it data collection. In truth, it was penance, though he could not admit it even to himself. The disease spread faster than his experiments could follow. The lesions became ulcers. The fever turned to delirium. He no longer slept. He heard voices in the hum of the electricity, whispers in the dripping water. Once he claimed to see angels of decay watching from the corners, wings made of gauze and bone. Outside, Munich was dying too. Allied planes flattened entire districts. The institute trembled with every explosion. But Heinrich refused to evacuate. When an SS officer arrived with orders to dismantle and relocate, he met him at the door, pistol in hand. "My work is not finished," he hissed. The officer left without another word. Within days, the remaining staff deserted. The institute became a mausoleum. One man, his dying wife, and his dying subject. The walls sweated moisture, the corridors echoed with coughing, and the smell of formalin could no longer mask the scent of rot. By midsummer, Liselott's mind began to dissolve. She wandered the halls at night in her nightgown, humming half-remembered songs, mistaking shadows for guests. Sometimes she spoke to Elias as though he were her child, sometimes her reflection. Heinrich observed her with both terror and fascination, jotting notes about neurosyphilitic regression. He began to see himself as both scientist and witness to divine punishment, a priest dissecting the theology of decay. In his notebooks, his handwriting shifted from neat precision to jagged spirals. Sentences like "flesh carries memory" and "contagion reveals truth" appeared among formulas. By August, he had stopped distinguishing between his wife and his specimen. To him, they were two halves of the same revelation, the fusion of purity and impurity, a cosmic irony too perfect to be accidental. One night, the fever consumed him as well. He awoke, drenched in sweat, convinced that something inside his veins was crawling. He stumbled to the mirror, searching his skin for the first rash, the telltale sign that he too had been claimed. When he found it, just below the collarbone, he did not scream. He smiled, a small, mad smile of acceptance. The contagion had completed its circle. The experiment was whole. By autumn, the institute was silent except for the wind. Elias no longer moved. Lieselotte barely breathed. Heinrich sat beside them both, surrounded by papers, glass slides, and jars of preserved tissue. His final entry read, "Infection equals union. The boundaries of sin and sanctity are illusions. The flesh remembers everything." After that, his notes stopped. When Allied troops finally reached Munich in early 1945, they found the building half destroyed, its windows shattered, its basement flooded with chemical residue. In one of the lower rooms, 3 bodies lay intertwined, indistinguishable at first glance. A burnt ledger nearby contained only fragments of words: purity, disease, redemption. No official report was ever published. The surviving officers claimed the site was of no strategic significance. The files were sealed, the institute's name erased. But those who entered that basement spoke of a smell that lingered long after they left, something between disinfectant and decay, as if the walls themselves still exhaled the memory of what had transpired there. They said the light bulbs flickered without power, that the floor beneath the old examination table pulsed faintly, like skin. Perhaps it was only imagination, the residue of horror. Or perhaps, as Heinrich once wrote, the flesh remembers everything. By January of 1945, Munich no longer resembled a city, but a wound that refused to close. The streets were lined with the carcasses of buildings, their facades torn open like ribs. Smoke hung permanently above the skyline, turning the air into a grey soup that tasted of brick dust and gunpowder. In that dying world, silence had become a form of survival. The silence of civilians who no longer asked questions, of soldiers who no longer believed in orders, and of a man named Heinrich Adler, who no longer distinguished between his laboratory and his conscience. Inside the institute, the walls dripped with condensation, the lights flickered sporadically, and the smell of rotting chemicals clung to every surface. Whatever had once been a place of research was now a crypt, and within that crypt, Heinrich wandered like a ghost, guarding a truth too monstrous to be spoken aloud. Elias's body, what remained of it, lay on the narrow cot beneath a sheet stiff with dried blood. His skin had taken on the pallor of old wax. His eyes, half open, reflected nothing. He was alive in the most technical sense, breathing shallowly, his chest rising only enough to prove that life could persist even when the will had gone. Lieselotte sat beside him in near darkness, her hair thin and grey, her fingers trembling as she traced invisible patterns on his arm. She no longer spoke in sentences, only fragments, verses from forgotten prayers, lines of lullabies, nonsense murmurs that dissolved into coughs. She had once believed herself the observer of her husband's sins. Now she was their accomplice and their victim. The fever had burned away her vanity, her intellect, even her identity. What remained was something elemental, an echo of womanhood stripped to bone and instinct, still reaching for warmth in a world that had grown too cold to give it. Heinrich watched them both with a gaze that had ceased to be human. The disease, once his enemy, had become his revelation. His body was weakening, his joints inflamed, his pupils constricted, his nerves betraying him with spasms, yet his mind raced with a clarity that bordered on the divine. He saw in the infection not failure, but transcendence, the ultimate union of purity and corruption. "The experiment is complete," he wrote in one of his final entries. "God's design has reversed itself through us. We have become proof that boundaries, male and female, science and sin, creator and creation, were lies from the beginning." He believed he had discovered something greater than medicine, the anatomy of blasphemy. But the discovery demanded witnesses, and there were none left to testify. The institute was cut off from the city, the telephones dead, the roads impassable. Even the soldiers who once guarded its perimeter had deserted. All that remained was the echo of footsteps in corridors that no longer led anywhere. On the night of February 12th, the power failed completely. The generator sputtered once and went silent, plunging the institute into a darkness so dense that even the rats stopped moving. Heinrich lit a candle and descended to the basement one last time. The flame trembled in his hand, casting wild shapes across the walls, shadows of instruments, glass jars, and the two bodies lying motionless in the corner. He stood over them for a long time, his face expressionless. "You are the beginning," he whispered, though it was unclear to whom he spoke, perhaps to Elias, perhaps to the disease itself. Then, with deliberate calm, he began burning his papers. The first pages went up in a flash of blue light, diagrams, anatomical sketches, measurements of bones, every trace of the years spent reducing the human soul to numbers. Smoke filled the room, acrid and oily. As he worked, he murmured fragments of his research, like a priest reciting a corrupted prayer. When the soldiers of the Allied advance reached Munich weeks later, they found the institute reduced to ruins. A bomb had struck the western wing, collapsing part of the roof and igniting the chemical stores. The official reports described it as total destruction, yet among the debris investigators found signs that suggested the fire had begun from within. An overturned lamp, traces of accelerant, and in the deepest chamber, a circle of scorched metal where a table had once stood. 3 bodies were recovered, though identification proved impossible. The remains had fused together, burned and melted into one another, until the boundaries between them vanished entirely. The American medical team called it unclassifiable human material. The records from the Institut für Erbgesundheit were confiscated, sealed, and buried in the archives of Nuremberg. None were ever made public, but silence, in war, is never perfect. One nurse who entered the ruins later claimed to have seen something strange among the ashes, a fragment of glass slide with a single drop of congealed amber fluid, perfectly preserved despite the fire. Under magnification, she said, the cells seemed to move, pulsing faintly as though alive. When she reported this, her superior ordered the specimen destroyed. Still, the story spread quietly through the ranks, acquiring the tone of superstition. They said the doctor who had worked there had found a way to make flesh remember sin, that even the dead could transmit guilt through blood. Others dismissed it as hysteria born of exhaustion. Yet the myth endured, passed from medic to medic, until it became just another ghost story in the ruins of Europe. For decades afterward, the Institute's existence was erased from maps. The land was reclaimed by weeds, the foundation filled with concrete. The only evidence that it had ever stood there was a small depression in the earth, where rainwater gathered after storms. Locals avoided the site, claiming their dogs refused to go near it. Children dared one another to approach and listen, to see if the ground still whispered. Some swore they could hear faint breathing beneath their feet, others the distant clinking of glass. Archaeologists who later excavated the area found melted instruments fused with human teeth, bone fragments trapped in metal clamps, and the remains of a woman's wedding ring bent into an oval shape. The reports were filed, redacted, forgotten. And so the story of Heinrich Adler Lieselotte and Elias Braun vanished into the bureaucratic abyss that swallowed so many wartime atrocities. But silence does not mean absence. It merely changes form. Somewhere, in the infinite archives of the world, a fragment of that truth still exists, a line in a forgotten file, a mislabeled photograph, a name scratched into a wall. And perhaps that is how history chooses to remember its greatest horrors, not through monuments or confessions, but through the quiet persistence of what refuses to die. The infection that began in one basement beneath Munich continued not in the flesh, but in the memory of those who touched its shadow. a contagion of knowledge, guilt, and fascination that no fire could ever truly erase. History has a way of swallowing its own crimes, of reducing screams to footnotes and ashes to silence. The war ended, borders shifted, flags changed, and yet beneath the reconstruction and the speeches, certain stories refused to rest. In the years that followed 1945, investigators, doctors, and historians tried to rebuild a coherent narrative of the horrors committed in the name of science. Some found evidence of camps, experiments, sterilizations, the familiar catalogue of nightmares. But of the Munich Institute and its director, Obersturmführer Heinrich Adler, there remained almost nothing. A few fragments of microfilm, one burned ledger, and a photograph whose edges were singed, showing a woman seated beside a hospital bed, her expression unreadable. The archives called it Exhibit 47B. To the bureaucrats, it was just another artifact of the Reich's medical crimes. To those who saw it closely, it was something else, an image that seemed to resist classification, just like the lives it had tried to erase. In 1953, a British journalist named Arthur Lenz visited Munich to document the ruins that still scarred the city. In an interview with an elderly caretaker, he heard mention of the doctor who lived beneath the birch trees. Curious, he followed the story to the outskirts where the institute had once stood. The building was gone, replaced by a warehouse. But when he stepped behind it, he noticed a depression in the soil, overgrown with weeds and thistles. There at dusk, the air felt heavier, almost charged. He described it later as a silence that listened back. Lenz collected small objects from the site, a corroded scalpel, a fragment of porcelain, a rusted tag marked with the number 47B. He sent them to London for analysis, but before any report was issued, the items disappeared from the record. The official explanation was misplacement. Unofficially, the museum's curator refused to store them, claiming that organic residue kept forming on the glass cases where they were kept. The truth of the Adler Institute remained buried, but its shadow lingered in subtler ways, in whispers among medical circles, in the nightmares of nurses who served in occupied hospitals, in the unease of archivists who handled files from that region. The story became a myth, then a rumor, then a silence again. Yet the silence was never complete. A letter discovered in 1972, hidden within the private collection of a retired SS officer, bore Adler's handwriting. It read only, "The disease was never of the flesh, it was of the soul, and the soul, once infected, multiplies." Scholars dismissed it as forgery, but the phrasing, calm, deliberate, theological, felt unmistakably his. It was the same cadence found in his old reports, where the boundaries between science and confession had already dissolved. If the infection of syphilis had destroyed his body, it seemed his ideas had survived. Invisible, incorporeal, alive. Decades later, genetic researchers studying wartime archives noticed anomalies in the documentation of specimens recorded under Elias Braun's number. The notes did not match standard protocols. There were references to self-regenerating cultures, residual motility, and unclassifiable chromosomal loops. Some samples, supposedly destroyed, appeared again under different project names in post-war American and Soviet research. Whether coincidence or continuity, no one could say. But it suggested something chilling, that the legacy of Adler's work had escaped not through testimony, but through data, replicated and rebranded under new scientific ambitions. And perhaps that is how evil survives, not through belief, but through curiosity, through the human hunger to understand, to experiment, to go further, even when the line between progress and monstrosity is blurred beyond recognition. The story of Elias Braun, the intersex prisoner who became both subject and symbol, was never properly told. His name did not appear in Nuremberg transcripts nor in any memorial, yet somewhere his body, dissected, preserved, fragmented, became part of the post-war archives that built the modern understanding of biology. His silence was transmuted into knowledge, his suffering into data. No monument bears his name, But every laboratory that studies the human genome unknowingly walks through the same moral labyrinth that began in places like Munich. As for Lieselot, there are no photographs of her after 1944, only a brief mention in a confiscated diary by a nurse stationed near Dachau. A woman came asking for medicine, feverish, with burns on her hands. She kept saying, "He will never stop burning." I gave her water. She smiled and walked into the forest. No trace of her was ever found. Perhaps she died there, among the birch trees that once surrounded the institute. Perhaps she was swallowed by the same silence that claimed her husband. And yet, the story endures, not because it was told, but because it was hidden too well. The human mind cannot resist the allure of what it cannot fully comprehend. There will always be those who search through forbidden files, who stare too long into the abyss of history, hoping to find order, when all that truly exists is chaos disguised as method. The Adler Institute was only one of many such abysses, but its particular horror lay not in the cruelty it inflicted, but in the mirror it held up to human ambition. It showed how easily intellect can serve depravity, how desire can masquerade as science, and how the line between salvation and damnation can vanish inside a single cell under a microscope. And perhaps that is the real infection, the one that never needed blood to spread, the one that passes through curiosity, fascination, and the quiet thrill of forbidden knowledge. It is in every age, every ideology, every discovery that begins with just to see what happens. It is in the very structure of remembrance, in the way we document, analyze, classify, and preserve. The experiment of Munich did not end in 1945. It continues each time someone forgets that progress without conscience is only another form of decay. This was only one story among the thousands swallowed by the war, one fragment of truth buried beneath 1,000 convenient lies. But for those who still listen to the silence beneath the earth, it whispers the same warning. The flesh remembers everything. And so, as the voice of this forgotten history fades once more into the dark, a single truth remains, uncomfortably alive. This was only one of the countless untold stories of the Second World War. If you want to uncover others, those buried, erased, or forbidden, subscribe, share this story, and keep the memory alive. Because silence, left unbroken, always returns.